my goal right now is not so much to tell you what I think about reading Madhyamaka text. In the initial outset, I want to present to you my reading of Jay and Sandy's disagreement. So what is really at stake in these two papers, and what we can learn from their disagreement going forward for ourselves. So in the end, I will speak a little bit about my own ideas for Madhyamaka and methodology. I'm going to read this paper, hopefully not too fast. At the outset of his paper, The Nature of the Madhyamaka Trick, Sandy makes the following pertinent observation. He says, even the most profound sense of historical authenticity is enmeshed in a complicated set of needs and desires. In making this observation, Sandy helpfully reminds us that all interpretation is connected with goals, and that desires are powerful causal factors in the production of meaning. Of course, as scholars of Buddhism, we cannot hear the word desire without experiencing some degree of conceptual blending with the Buddha's teaching of the Second Noble Truth. For those who may not be familiar with this truth, it states that the cause of suffering is desire. So insofar as we agree that interpretation is connected with desires, we raise the troubling possibility that, at least in certain Buddhist universes, interpretation is also connected with suffering. Now, I don't think that any of us has come here to suffer, but we have come here to discuss interpretation, and to the extent that our interpretations are connected with desires, we should attempt to be mindful not only about, to use Sandy's metaphor, the subterranean foundation of desire from which they arise, but also about the directions in which our conversations are leading. It's a curious fact that we can be more or less aware of our own desires. One advantage to any discussion of methodology is that it prompts us to take a closer look at our own, perhaps subconscious presuppositions, goals, and desires in relation to the intellectual projects in which we are engaged. Unmasking our presuppositions and desires may be greatly aided through a dialogical process in which others articulate their perceptions of our implicit assumptions. And while we may still wish to rebuff or refine those perceptions, being asked to examine them improves our chances of increasing our own self-awareness. Sandy's paper is a useful starting point in this conversation, since it presents us with both his own assessment of the presuppositions and desires present in certain attempts to interpret Nagarjuna, and his own prescription for a better way to read Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka writings. I will let others respond to Sandy's description, or perhaps caricature would be a better term, of their methods. My focus here is on what Sandy himself is trying to do when he reads Nagarjuna. A central aspect of his project can be gleaned from the quotation I cited earlier, where Sandy refers to a sense of historical authenticity. Later, he insists that his interests are primarily historical, and he claims that the compulsion, quote, to force a logical grid over the work of a writer who is so obviously and profoundly distrustful of logic, end quote, derives in no small measure, quote, from a skewed understanding of the intellectual history of Indian Buddhism. From this point forward, Sandy spends considerable energy in an attempt to realign our understanding of both Indian and Tibetan intellectual history. His goal is to show that traditional Buddhists, no less than Western scholars, have been seduced by a desire for rational certainty that can be encapsulated in a single correct view. Only a few luminaries throughout the ages have been able to resist the trend and to read Nagarjuna's works in the radical light for which they call, taking seriously the many passages in which the author repudiates the very notion of a view and explicitly rejects that he holds a thesis. Of course, such an approach to reading Nagarjuna immediately begs the question of why Nagarjuna's works include so many passages that appear to present arguments in rational terms. Sandy asked us to read such passages in light of the no thesis, no view perspective, and to see that the appearance of rational argumentation is just an appearance. In stated contrast to Richard Robinson's and Richard Hayes' contention that Nagarjuna engages in a specifically logical trick, Sandy suggests instead that Nagarjuna employs a literary trick. That is, Nagarjuna's use of what appears to be rational argumentation is, like a trompe-l'oeil, designed to disturb and provoke its readers by virtue of the fact that it appears to be something it is not, something graspable, in Sandy's words. The ultimate aim of this method is to open up a space in which, quote, it appears possible to completely cease identifying with any doctrine, tenet, thesis, or point of view, unquote, where one might, quote, surrender the compulsion to know something for certain, to command, demonstrate, prove, or disprove something once and for all, including the validity of rational argumentation itself. Sandy's reading of Nagarjuna tries to grapple with Nagarjuna's writings less in terms of their contents than in terms of their effects on readers. Although he starts his article with a reference to historical authenticity, and although he locates the source of what he takes to be mistaken interpretation of Nagarjuna in a skewed intellectual history, he claims at the end that quote, the real issue here is not about who is the legitimate historian. Rather, he wants to find a persuasive, interesting, cogent, and engaging interpretation that may be adopted strictly on its own merits, and not with reference to some kind of methodological purity. Yet Sandy's own methodology cries out for clarification, offering us a reading that might feel at home if supported with the tools of reader response theory or the like. He nonetheless spends many pages exploring a sort of intellectual etiology of the mistaken rationalist approach to Nagarjuna. If certainty and grasping at a correct interpretation is not what Sandy is after, then why bother correcting others? If what is important are the dimensions, literary and otherwise, of the work that may provoke transformations in readers, then why bother with intellectual history at all? We will return to these questions, but first let's take a look at Jay's response to Sandy's paper in his article, Turning a Madhyamaka Trick, Reply to Huntington. And I think that I actually just read the unpublished version, so I'm hoping it's pretty similar. Before defending himself, Jay lays out his understanding of Sandy's critique, identifying two distinct charges. He calls the first of these a substantive charge, according to which Sandy is accusing Jay and those like him of incorrectly ascribing rational arguments to Nagarjuna, a la the, quote, crypto-svatantrika Tibetan commentarial tradition. Clearly, this accusation is galling to Jay, who claims to be, quote, outraged to be charged with taking Bhava Viveka's side against Chandrakirti. Jay shares Sandy's obvious disdain for Bhavya and his admiration of Chandra. Yet despite this agreement on their own intellectual pedigree, they seem diametrically opposed on the question of how to read Nagarjuna. This tells us something, perhaps about their own subterranean desires. The second charge Jay identifies in Sandy's critique is the hermeneutic charge. This charge comes down to the idea that it is inappropriate to use the tools of modern logic or analytic philosophy to interpret Nagarjuna, since such tools, quote, impose an interpretive framework upon the text that their authors would reject as a method for understanding them. Any interpretation issuing from such a method would be a foreign imposition, a kind of violence to the text. Using such tools also may be seen as evidence that one has not allowed the text to work upon one, excuse me, in the requisite manner, since one will persist in the misguided use of reasons and arguments and search for certainty. Jay's response to the hermeneutic charge is to forcefully point out that the use of reason and argument is actually required for the interpretation of Nagarjuna's writing, or for that matter, any text. We just heard Jay articulate this again. He notes that Sandy himself uses arguments and offers reasons, and he sees no reason why we should, or even that we can, refrain from doing so. Where Jay does not specifically defend himself, at least in this paper, is in relation to the use of the specific tools of logic and analytic philosophy. He sticks instead to a defense of reason and argumentation. Excuse me. But the thrust is clear. In Jay's words, a commitment to reason is a transcendental condition of interpretability. So much for the hermeneutic charge. Now on to what Jay considers the more important issue raised by Sandy, namely, quote, what Nagarjuna's and Chandrakirti's texts actually mean. After suitable Gadamerean caveats about the impossibility of recovering authorial intent, Jay presents numerous quotes to show that Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti both use arguments and give reasons in support of philosophical positions. Of course, this statement can be seen as controversial in light of Nagarjuna's assertion that he has no thesis, and in light of his teachings of the importance of relinquishing views. So a question arises concerning what Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti are doing when they present arguments, or in Sandy's terms, when they present what appear to be arguments. Jay's basic answer to this question, as I take it, is that Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti are presenting arguments for a form of epistemic coherentism in which knowledge is both foundationless and justified through conventional epistemic practices. He further thinks that they are arguing for, quote, the inconsistency of reality. As Jay puts it, Nagarjuna, quote, demonstrates that it is rational to regard phenomena as empty and that one cannot adopt that view consistently and remain rational. This is what Jay understands to be Nagarjuna's paraconsistent logic, or as he discusses elsewhere, his cogent inconsistency. And I think we can agree with Jay that the logic he exposes in his papers is, quote, pretty interesting, even if not all of us can understand the diagrams that sometimes accompany it. But the idea that we cannot adopt this view consistently and remain rational brings us back to the question of where Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti are trying to lead us through the presentation of arguments, or what appear to be arguments. Jay discusses this in an article co-authored with Graham Priest and published in Pointing at the Moon, a recent book on Buddhism, logic, and analytic philosophy, edited by Jay, Mario, and Tom Tillemans. The title of the article is Mountains Are Just Mountains, a reference to a Zen saying, and we heard a bit about this last night. The authors give their rendition of the saying as follows. Before I studied Zen, mountains were mountains and water was water. After studying Zen for some time, mountains were no longer mountains and water was no longer water. And now, after studying Zen longer, mountains are just mountains and water is just water. The gloss that Jay and Graham give to this aphorism is that it represents a dialectic. In this dialectic, one first sees things in the ordinary worldly manner that is imbued with ignorance. That is, by superimposing essences, nature, substance, what have you, on the world. Here, mountains are mountains just as they have always seemed to have been. After studying Zen, and here we should note that the original quotation the authors supply in their end notes refers to practicing Chan, whereas the authors give the term studying. Interesting. But anyway, after studying Zen, one eventually comes to see that the things in the world, in fact, lack essences, natures, substance, and so on. Now mountains are no longer mountains, as one has been disabused of the erroneous superimposition that previously appeared to give mountains their essential natures. However, after studying or practicing a bit more, one understands in the third moment of the dialectic that even the lack of essence, nature, substance, or what have you is not absolute. In other words, that lack also lacks any essence, nature, substance, or the like. So with this recognition in place, mountains are again mountains, but this time they are just mountains. In other words, one sees them as mountains, but one no longer reifies either the mountain's ultimately unreal essences or the mountain's lack thereof. Jay and Graham use this aphorism to help convey their understanding of Nagarjuna's use of the Chatushkoti, the tetralemma that states that none of the four possibilities of being real, unreal, both, or neither is an accurate description of the nature of things. The authors attempt to disambiguate the four lemmas of the Chatushkoti by referring to the two truths, conventional and ultimate. On this reading, things are real conventionally, unreal ultimately, both real and unreal conventionally and ultimately respectively, and neither real nor unreal ultimately and conventionally respectively. While this reading invokes the ultimate, the statements themselves are all made at the level of conventional truth, being statements. Thus, although the ultimate, I'm very sorry about the coughing, just give me a second here. That season. Thus, although the ultimate truth itself does not actually exist, it is nonetheless possible to assert the conventional statement, quote, there is no ultimate truth. Since a conventional statement itself is an ultimate truth, in the sense that truths in propositional format are conventional. So let me say that again. This conventional statement is an ultimate truth. In this regard, ultimate truth may be considered contradictory. Let me explain this one more time. Thus, although the ultimate truth itself does not actually exist, it is nonetheless possible to assert the conventional statement, quote, there is no ultimate truth. This is a conventional statement which expresses what we would conventionally call an ultimate truth. And in this regard, ultimate truth may be considered contradictory. Another such conventional ultimate truth is that no distinction exists between the conventional and the ultimate. Conventional truth must therefore also be seen as contradictory. Applying the tools of modern logic, Jay and Graham propose that Nagarjuna implies, therefore, a fifth value, quote, none of the above, which applies to statements concerning ultimate reality, and which, however, is not a real value in the manner of the four actual possibilities of real, unreal, both, and neither. Unlike these other choices, the fifth value is, quote, self-dismantling, and the result is that Nagarjuna can be seen to embrace an inconsistent, though not incoherent, perspective on reality.